evening. Welcome to the Department of Mass Media's 2018 Nadine B. Andreas Speaker, Leonard Pitts, Jr. I know he needs very little in the way of introduction. He's a 2004 Pulitzer Prize winner for commentary, a columnist for the Miami Herald, and an accomplished novelist. So let's welcome him to the stage, Leonard Pitts, Jr.
Thank you very much. Amy told me it's going to be a short introduction, but boy, she wasn't kidding. I was like, there he is, let's bring him on out. Good evening, everyone. As you know, if you've seen the millions of signs on campus, our topic for tonight is going to be the United States of Amnesia, the forgetting of African American history. To put that another way, I want to spend a few moments talking to you about the importance of bearing witness. Now, I'm not a preacher, and this is not a sermon, but I do want to begin in the Bible because there's a verse there that haunts me whenever I stop to consider this nation's stewardship of its African American history. In the 6th verse of the 4th chapter of the book of Hosea, the prophet writes the following: "My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge." My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. I think that there is great and profound truth in those words. The problem, however, is that our lack of knowledge is something many of us treasure and protect at all costs, especially when it comes to the history of African America. A couple years ago, LeVar Burton, the actor who became famous in 1977 playing Kunta Kinte in a miniseries called Roots, produced a new version of that show, which centered on the generations of an African American family stolen into slavery and enduring into freedom. For this, he was criticized by the conservative columnist Cal Thomas, who wrote, quote, "While there is no question that slavery has left an indelible mark on the descendants of slaves and the nation, continuing to dwell on that subject does nothing to improve a single black life. Roots is depressing. Stories about," yeah, you know, that's slavery. It's just it's such a downer. Continuing with Cal's quote, "Roots is depressing. Stories about overcoming obstacles are inspirational and can produce motivation." Now, as appalling as Cal Thomas's words were, what is really appalling is that he was just co-signing an opinion from Snoop Dogg, the African-American rapper whose contributions to American cinema include Soul Plane and Scary Movie 5. Snoop complained on Instagram about the new Roots, saying, quote, "They just want to keep showing the abuse we took hundreds and hundreds of years ago. When y'all gonna make a expletive series about the success black folks is having? The only success we have is Roots and 12 Years a Slave." Now, putting aside for a moment the fact that Snoop's desire for a expletive series about the success black folks is having is answered by shows like Blackish, Scandal, Being Mary Jane, Insecure, How to Get Away with Murder, and Empire, instead ask yourself this: can you imagine a non-Jewish newspaper columnist dismissing a new Holocaust film on the grounds that the Holocaust is depressing and that Jews should seek more inspirational fare? Can you imagine a Jewish American entertainer complaining that they just want to show the abuse that Jews took during that nightmare era? Now, counting television and film, about 3 times as many productions have been made about the 12-year tragedy of the Holocaust as about the 246-year tragedy of American slavery. That includes The Zookeeper's Wife, which was released just last year. Do you remember anybody complaining about that movie's subject matter? Do you remember anybody saying, okay, that's enough Holocaust movies? Of course not. And the reason is fairly simple. You see, a movie about the Holocaust moves and shakes us, challenges and saddens us, but it does not indict us. We mourn for what was inflicted by people over there, against people over there. But African American history offers no such distance. It is not about the people over there. It is about people right here. It is about what some of us did and still do, about what some of us suffered and still suffer. In that sense, African American history is the ultimate inconvenience. It is not uncommon to find African Americans like Snoop who would prefer to just forget it, not deal with the thorny tangle of emotions that rise at the thought of the indignities, humiliations, and abuse that our fathers and our mothers endured. I remember begging African American friends to go and see 12 Years a Slave. I also remember interviewing two women who witnessed a lynching in 1930, and they grew angry with me for asking them about it. Nor is it uncommon to encounter white Americans like Cal Thomas who wish black history would just go away. A few years back, Margaret Beiser, a white woman who was employed as a docent on a historic southern plantation, recalled how she was chastised by some of her customers for talking about slavery. She was, one man told her, bringing America down. The other thing that Beiser recalled from that job was the stunning ignorance embodied in the questions that her white customers asked her. Questions like, did the slaves appreciate how well taken care of they were? Were they allowed to sign up for jobs they wanted? Were the slaves paid for the work that they did? To hear those questions is to fear that Cal Thomas is getting his wish. To look at statistics on America's understanding of its own history is to be sure of it. For example, most Americans and 2/3 of white Americans in the former states of the Confederacy think slavery was not the cause of the Civil War. Cal Thomas should be pleased. Where the painful facts of the African American story are concerned, we are living in the United States of amnesia. We are losing this troubling and inconvenient history. And in the process, I submit that we are losing our last best chance to be the America so many of us love to rhapsodize about, the one where all women and men stand level before the law, the one where opportunity falls upon all of us with the disinterested equality of the rain, the one where our children are judged, are advantaged and disadvantaged, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. We are losing the America we could be because we lack the courage to face the America that we were and the America that we are. We duck it, we deny it, we ignore it, we forget about it, we do everything except face it. Now, you might disagree with me on that. You might note that we have an entire month of the year dedicated to the celebration of that history. And I would disagree with you. I'm not saying that Black History Month does not exist. Obviously, it does. Every February, we dutifully talk about the achievements of Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, who performed the first successful open heart surgery, or Madam C.J. Walker, who was the first American woman to become a self-made millionaire, or George Washington Carver, who found hundreds of ways to use a peanut. But we never speak to the America that they endured, because that part hurts too much, because we don't know what to do with the feelings that raises, so we choose amnesia instead. If some of you may have seen, last week, a teacher in the state of Texas got into trouble for assigning her students a homework project to list the positive and negative aspects of slavery. I remember something that happened to me when ABC television aired The First Roots, 41 years ago. For those of you who are too young to remember the days when there were only 3 television networks, and everybody in the family would gather in the same room to watch the same show at the same time, it will be hard to appreciate the impact of that show. Suffice it to say, it was bigger than Empire, Game of Thrones, and The Voice combined. It was the equivalent of 6 Super Bowls back to back, a program watched by everybody, everywhere at the same time. The first episode introduced us to a Mandinka boy named Kunta Kinte, played, as I said a moment ago, by LeVar Burton. We bore witness as he grew up in the bosom of his family. We bore witness as he struggled with the lessons of boyhood and young manhood. And then one day we bore witness as he ventured away from his village, searching for wood with which to make a drum as a gift for his younger brother. We bore witness as white men on horseback ran him down, captured him with a net, put manacles on his wrists, chained him down into the dark and stinking hold of their ship. We bore witness as a free man was made into a slave. And I'm here to tell you that it hurt. It hurt like hell. I was a student then. I was a junior at the University of Southern California, and I worked part-time at the student bookstore. My friend and co-worker was a white guy named Dave Whitesell. Dave and I used to pass the hours on the job, goofing on each other and laughing the way that you do when you're 19 years old and nothing in the world is all that serious. It was different the day after the first installment of Roots aired. I remember feeling angry that day, angry and righteous, and there was a lot of that going around. Black folks walked around the campus that day. We traded these knowing looks and these grim nods of recognition. Something had awakened in us, something that gave a name and a face and a reason to this sense of alienation that we had carried with us for so long that it had become second nature. White folks stayed out of our way that day. Something else I remember, the silences between friends, the averted eyes, the conversations that were suddenly formal and stilted where the day before they had been easy and offhanded. Dave hardly spoke to me at all that day, wouldn't even look my way. The air was charged between us in a way that it had never been before. Finally, somewhere near the end of the day, Dave came up to me and said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know." And I remember feeling vindicated by that apology. Dave felt guilty, I felt angry, and neither one of those is a pleasant emotion. Neither one of those is something that you want to carry with you if you can help it. So it's not hard to understand why people find amnesia easier, why they prefer to talk about achievements and milestones, Williams's surgery, Walker's money, Carver's peanut, Obama's presidency. But these achievements did not happen in a vacuum. Indeed, the thing that makes stories like these truly outstanding is the context in which they took place. Daniel Hale Williams performed his pioneering surgery in 1893, 2 years before a landmark Supreme Court ruling that said it was legal to require black people to ride separate train cars, drink from separate fountains, go to separate schools, be buried in separate cemeteries. Dr. Carver achieved his scientific feats despite the fact that when he was born in 1864, he was the legal property of another human being with the same rights and standing under the law as a horse or a dog. Madam Walker made her money at a time when it was common for mobs of Christian white Americans to hang black men by their necks from ropes, to burn them alive, to sell and trade their body parts as souvenirs. And Obama won his presidency, even though significant numbers of Americans said he was not one of them, and many even told pollsters flat out they would not vote for him because he was black. This context is what makes lives like theirs outstanding, and yet this is what we don't talk about so much as blacks to whites and whites to blacks. And even when we do talk about it, we seem unable to get beyond that first base, that uncomfortable place where Dave and I found ourselves on the day after the first episode of Roots aired. Righteous anger on the one side and shamefaced guilt on the other. Maybe we can hardly have been expected to have reacted differently. I mean, if you can read this nation's history of atrocities based on color of skin without being angry, something is wrong with you. And if you are brought face to face with the fact that your ancestors, your fathers and mothers, either committed those atrocities or simply benefited from them and passed those benefits on to you, then it has to impact your view of your forebears, your nation, and yourself. I am a firm believer in the axiom that says that if you don't learn history, you repeat it. So you can't just say, this makes me uncomfortable, let's forget it and never speak of it again. But by the same token, what is the point of history if all it leads to is anger or guilt? We have never learned to push ourselves through those hard emotions. We have never sought to find out who we might become on the other side. But what if we could? What would the world look like then? Would we reach a point where we could mourn together for the sins of the past and work together for the redemption of the future? It is a tantalizing possibility, but again, the problem is we lack the moral courage to seize it. Back in 1997, a bill was introduced in Congress that would have authorized a national apology for slavery as a means of getting past this impasse. I was intrigued by the anger of the white response to it. Newt Gingrich said it was mere symbolism, which of course it was, just like the Statue of Liberty, the Liberty Bell, and Mount Rushmore. Other observers pointed out that they never owned any slaves, so why should they apologize? But of course, a national apology does not come from any individual, and it does not come from a race. It comes from the country as a corporate body. So, for example, I never personally interned any Japanese Americans during the Second World War, but I certainly was not offended when the nation apologized for that. Most of us were not. But slavery is different, isn't it? It carries all this baggage of anger and guilt, recrimination and denial. The apology would have cost nothing except the will to give it. But it is the will that we were lacking. The bill was never enacted. And that tells you something about the volatile mix of emotions that are at play. That same year, 1997, I wrote a column about a guy named Joe Hudson. He was a black man who was a radio talk show host in Detroit, and Hudson had his own roots story. He told me about a white colleague named Norman who met him at the water cooler the day after the first episode aired and said simply, "If any of my ancestors inflicted harm on any of yours, I apologize." Hudson told me that the effect of that on him was so profound that he began to wonder what would happen in this country if Norman's gesture was repeated on a large scale, if the nation apologized for its mistreatment of its African children. What would happen if the country said to its citizens of African descent, as it once did to its citizens of Japanese descent, "We did you wrong, and we're sorry"? I was not prepared for the response that that column generated. I mean, there was a lot of anger and a lot of hatred and hate mail, yeah, but there were also a great many white readers who called me crying, sighing, weeping into the telephone in shame and relief and asking forgiveness as if I could absolve them in the name of 40 million black Americans. I will tell you the truth. It made me profoundly uncomfortable. I did not know these people, yet somehow I had made myself their priest, their bartender, and their rabbi. The object of all their confessions. Somehow I had tapped into a need I had not even known was there, a need for absolution and resolution, a need to find a way forward. A white woman asked me in a plaintive tone, "Why can't you all just forgive us?" And the answer, of course, was simple: you've never asked. I once spoke about these things with a man named Mark Weitzman. Mark was then the director of the Simon Wiesenthal Center's Task Force Against Hate. Weitzman is a Jew who has spent a great deal of time studying the relationship between Jews and Germans in the decades after the Holocaust. And he saw a moral parallel between modern-day white Americans and Germans who came up in Germany right after the Holocaust. He told me, quote, "Jews and Germans are linked in a way neither of them would choose. In some ways, the issue is more a German problem than a Jewish problem. Putting it simply, if I had a choice between committing murder and being murdered, I'm not sure about my physical reaction, but I know my moral reaction. The Germans have to face up to the fact that their country chose the path of murder, and that's a harder burden to carry in a moral sense." And he added this, quote, "I don't hold anyone who was not born at the time personally guilty for anything. But a sense of responsibility," he said, "that is different. We all," quote, "we all have a sense of responsibility based on the past that we inherit." In other words, we are all children of our fathers and mothers. We are all heirs to history, the triumphs and failures alike. And you cannot escape that. You cannot forget that. As a moral matter, you should not even try. Now, you may think that I'm arguing that the nation owes an apology to African American people for its treatment of them. You may think I'm saying it should pay reparations for the labor, land, names, children, homes, and lives that it stole from them during slavery and Jim Crow. I believe both those things. I believe finding some form of reckoning was certainly healthy for Germany and for South Africa, imperfect as the process was in both those places. But the point I am making is actually larger than the specific mechanism of how we come to terms with our past. The point I am making is this: when someone acknowledges your pain, it validates you. It makes you feel, perhaps for the very first time, seen. And when someone forgives you, it releases you. It lets you up. And when you are able to release anger and guilt, it makes you free. And if it is true that African American people have never been fully free, it is also true that in a very real sense, white ones haven't either. For there to be slaves, there must also be masters. For there to be oppression, there must be oppressors. Have you ever hated someone? Have you ever hated somebody? It's hard work. It requires you to pay inordinate attention to their lives, to detest their pleasures and plot their pains. So think for a moment about the price that Jim Crow exacted from white people in this country. Think of the literature and the music. Think of the friendships and the kinships. Think of the love affairs and the small pleasures. Think of the fine meals and the lazy evenings. Think of the simple self-evident truths that they were forced to deny themselves in order to protect the fiction of segregation and supremacy. Looked at in that sense, ain't none of us ever been free. Weitzman was right. Like Jews and Germans, blacks and whites are bound in a relationship neither of us would have ever chosen. You know what? Sometimes history hurts. We need to understand that truth and make peace with it. See, we all want to partake of history when it makes us feel good, when it flatters our national pride. We have no problem bearing witness for D-Day, the D-Day invasion, and believing that this says something about us as a nation. We have no problem bearing witness for Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill and believing that this says something about us as a nation. Bearing witness for the Marshall Plan or the moon landing or the First Amendment and believing that these things say something about us as a nation. But we become a nation of amnesia when it comes to slave catchers and men in white hoods, voting rights violations and restrictive housing covenants. We resist the idea that these things too say something about us as a nation, but they do. That's why we remember. That's why we bear witness and do so not simply for our own people, but for all people who have been oppressed. Because at the end of the day, the race that is at issue here is neither black nor white, but human. 12 years ago, actually 13 years ago now, in that spirit, I went to Poland, where I joined in a Holocaust remembrance tour. We went to Auschwitz, Treblinka, Majdanek, Belzec, and other places where the notion of race and racial supremacy was played out to its awful and logical end. One of our leaders was Joe Engel, a survivor of Auschwitz, and one night in a restaurant, he raised a toast. Joe was looking at me, the only African American in the group, with a steady and direct gaze as he spoke. His English was imperfect but heartfelt, and he said, quote, "So I hope if we all get home, we're going to spread the Holocaust to make people know what the survivors went through so their kids can live in freedom. They shouldn't have to worry for Holocaust because we all won. If we cannot be one and looking out for one another, the world going to come to an end." That's what it says. Don't you ever forget me so long as you gon' live. You tell this story for us because we not here to tell this story. What he said applied to victims of mass slaughter on the other side of the planet. But it also applied to victims of enslavement and degradation right here in this country. Don't you ever forget me so long as you gonna live. You tell this story for us because we not here to tell this story. We owe ourselves better, and we owe them better, than to be the United States of amnesia. So I ask you to remember, I ask you to bear witness for the educator Mary McLeod Bethune, bear witness for the white abolitionist Elijah P. Lovejoy, bear witness for Viola Liuzzo, the white voting rights martyr, bear witness for Sam Hose, whose body was dismembered by a white mob, bear witness for Martin and for Malcolm, who said the unsayable things and paid for it with their lives. Bear witness for some slave whose name history forgot and some victim of the convict leasing system lying in an unmarked grave. And bear witness for the hope that we Americans of diverse heritage can find common ground in our common pain, can know our history and yet not be bound by it, can be rooted and yet fly. And bear witness, because if we don't remember and tell this story, I promise you somebody else will, and you will not recognize your own story when they are done. Indeed, this is already happening. Or perhaps you didn't hear about Glenn Beck telling his audience a few years ago about how people like them started the civil rights movement. Maybe you didn't see the textbooks in Texas where they referred to slaves as workers, and the textbooks in Virginia that called them settlers. Maybe, we got more to go. Maybe you didn't see where a school board in Colorado issued a directive requiring that students be taught only positive aspects of history. Maybe you didn't hear where the former governor of Mississippi, Haley Barbour, declared that integration in his state was, and I quote, a very pleasant experience. So bear witness, because morally we have no choice. Let me tell you one final story. This is about a lynching that took place in Marion, Indiana in 1930. I alluded to it a moment ago. A survivor of the lynching, a man named James Cameron, just like the movie director, James Cameron, told the story to me. He told me how he accepted a ride from two of his friends, Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith, how the two of them started talking robbery, how they drove to the local Lover's Lane, how they gave him a gun as they walked up to the car, how he recognized the white man who opened the car door. His name was Claude Dieter, and sometimes he came to get his shoes shined at Cameron's stand at the train station. Cameron told me that broke the spell. He dropped the gun and ran. He was 2 blocks away when he heard the gunshot ring out. Cameron, who was 16 at the time, ran home. He spent 2 or 3 hours pacing in his bedroom. When he heard police at the door, he jumped into bed and pretended to be asleep. The officers hauled him out of bed and took him to the police station. A crowd of about 15 or 20 people stood on the sidewalk, waiting, watching. Cameron was interrogated by Sheriff Jacob Campbell, who demanded details of how he had shot Claude Dieter and raped Dieter's girlfriend, Mary Ball. Mary Ball would later testify that she was never sexually assaulted. Cameron spent 2 or 3 hours telling the police that he wasn't there. As he spoke, he told me the sheriff was writing a document out by hand. Then, said Cameron, the sheriff gave a nod to the officers in the room. They knocked him out of the chair, threw him to the floor, and, he said, quote, started tromping on me like I was a snake or something. After a few moments, they put him back in the chair, and the sheriff shoved the paper toward him and told him to sign it. Cameron leaned forward to see what it was that he was signing. He said he was hit upside the head so hard it felt like a wrecking ball against a building. The cop that hit him growled. The sheriff said, sign it, not read it. So he signed it. He found out later that it was his confession. All the next day, a crowd outside the jail grew bigger rather. Somebody hoisted Claude Dieter's bloody shirt on the flagpole. At 1:30 that afternoon came the news that Dieter had died. Shortly after 8 that night, rocks began slamming against the jailhouse windows and the mob came forward. Sheriff Campbell ordered his men not to shoot because there were women and children in the crowd. 4 men took sledgehammers to the jailhouse door. It took them an hour, but they loosened the mortar around the casing and then snatched the door right out. And their hands were bloody, but the jail was theirs. Shipp was the first to die. He was beaten to death. Then they took Smith and rammed a crowbar through his chest. They wrapped Shipp in a Ku Klux Klan robe and hanged both men in a tree. Then the cry went up, "We want Cameron, we want Cameron." James Cameron told me, quote, I thought the blood would freeze in my body. They walked in and said, quote, all you niggers get on this side of the jail and all you other guys get over there. They said, quote, Cameron is in here, and if you don't tell us where he is, we're going to lynch every goddamn one of you niggers. And man, this is still James Cameron speaking, and man, what did they want to say that for? Half the blacks in there fell down on their hands and knees and started to crawl around like trained animals. They were hugging the white men's legs and kissing their hands, slobbering just like babies. Lordy, Mr. White Man, please don't hang us. We ain't nothing but a bunch of poor niggas in here for train riding. Ain't no James Cameron in here. Cameron started crying when he reached this part of the story. He told me, quote, I've had 8 movie offers, but how in the world are they going to film something like that? All of those black men crawling around on their hands and knees. Finally, the leader of the mob threatened to lynch every black man in the jail. And a man who was in that cell with a 16-year-old son finally broke and said, no, Mr. White folks, please don't lynch us. There he is right there. That's him. Cameron told me that they beat him senseless and had him under the tree with the lynch rope around his neck when somebody yelled out that he hadn't done anything and that they should take him back. That voice has never been authoritatively identified. If you look in the newspapers of the time, there's one that says it was the girl's uncle, several others that don't mention any voice. But Cameron always said, until the day he died just a few years ago, that the voice was the voice of God. He was allowed to go back into the jail. Meantime, a man named Lawrence Beitler, who owned a camera shop, came out and took a picture of the remains of Shipp and Smith in that tree. As was the custom back then, thousands of prints were made and sold as souvenirs. Beitler's picture is one of the most famous of all the lynch photos. It is one of the most horrifying, too. Now, the thing that makes it horrifying is not Shipp and Smith hanging in that tree, beaten and broken and beyond all pain. It is rather the crowd of Christian white men and women laughing and smiling and behaving for all the world as if they're at the county fair. After I interviewed Cameron in Milwaukee, I drove down to Marion to see the place where this happened, and I spoke to some of the old people who were living there. I remember a couple of black women. I told you about them a moment ago, Sarah Weaver Pate and Clara Edwards. I also spoke to a white man named Jack Edwards, who was the mayor in 1930. The thing that strikes me about all of them is that the moment that you mentioned to them what it was you wanted to talk about, they underwent this amazing physical change. Their hands shook, their voices trembled, and their eyes turned inward. I'd rather just forget that, said Weaver Pate. Why bring that up, snapped Jeffries. We are ashamed of it, said Edwards, the former mayor. It will never be erased. And I find myself wondering, how often does that happen? How often do we as white Americans and we as African Americans find ourselves staring into the exact same pain from opposite sides? People say to me often that we should no longer consider ourselves African Americans and white Americans and all the other different kinds of Americans. We should all just be Americans, period. And I say to myself, fine, but do you really understand what that means? Do we have the imagination and the courage to face beyond, he said, to face beyond our guilt and anger and find strength and resolve in this pain? If you are white, can you look at that picture that Lawrence Beitler took and mourn because those are your people hanging in that tree, broken, bloodied, and dead? If you are black, can you look into that picture and feel ashamed because those are your people posing with the bodies like fishermen with a prize catch? If you are an American, can you stare into that image and remember that you are heir to a history that is pain and promise, trauma and triumph, and you can't choose the one and ignore the other. You are not heir to part of the story, you are heir to the whole story. And can you confess that we are not yet where we ought to be, but not yet where we want to be, but by the grace of God, no longer what we used to be? James Cameron told me that once in Israel, he saw an inscription that said, "To remember is salvation, to forget is exile." An oppressed people, he told me, find their strength and identity in remembering their passages. I ask you to help me to bear witness for that. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, and we have about 25 minutes for questions, if anybody would like to do that.
Nobody's got any questions, do you?
And this is Jennifer Skalicki. She's one of our graduating seniors, and she will take the mic around if you have questions.
Find me a good one, Jennifer. No pressure.
Mr. Pitts, I'd like to thank you for coming to Mankato.
Thank you.
But a few months ago or a few weeks ago, Oprah Winfrey had an article or a presentation on 60 Minutes.
You at the Lynching Museum?
Yes. What's your pulse on that as far as the impact it had in the community and in this country?
You're talking about lynching or the museum itself?
The museum itself, yes.
I have heard that there was a lot of blowback on her story. A lot of people were angry that the museum is opening and that she did a piece on it, which fits in with what I'm saying. People don't want to, there's stuff that we don't want to deal with. We find it too painful to deal with. On a smaller scale, you know, not anything as large as the museum, but I find it very telling that there's a sign at the Tallahatchie River where Emmett Till's body was fished out. Emmett Till is a 14-year-old lynch mob victim, murder victim. When he was killed in 1955, there's a sign by the Tallahatchie River, and they can't keep the sign up because somebody keeps shooting it full of holes. It's the same thing. It's all of a piece. It's all the same. That's the same as the blowback on the Oprah Winfrey story, as the teacher in Texas saying, let's talk about the positive aspects of African American history. It's all part of a piece of people not really wanting to deal with what happened in this country. And again, I understand why, but I think that that's a dangerous and frankly a morally indefensible thing.
Thank you, sir. Really appreciate your speech. You spoke so eloquently. My name is Bikash. I'm an international student here studying political science. I come from India, so we also had our fair share of British imperialism and also our own creation with the caste system. From what you spoke about, I have a question which is more as to what younger generation, what do you propose for younger generations that they can do more to grapple with the issue, to change what has been done in the past? What do you suggest for the younger generation?
Well,
is it only reading more and more, or is it actions, or what is it?
I mean, obviously you can't change what was done in the past, but I think that it is very important, not just for the younger generation, but for all of us to become educated in this kind of stuff. The thing is that this information is withheld strategically, frankly, from younger people. I am so appalled by how many young people I talk to who have no idea what America was like just in their parents' or grandparents' generations. So if you're going to educate yourself about this, thank God there are still libraries, and bookstores and other resources. Make up your mind, I think the first and most important thing anybody can do in terms of the preservation of African American history is to go read. On the Miami Herald's website, on my page, I've actually put together a reading list for people who are interested in delving more into this, because I think that it is necessary to know. This stuff is necessary to understand if you're going to have any kind of depth understanding of what this country is. So reading is first. After you've done some reading, then a lot of the things that you see going on in this country will be less incomprehensible to you, and you'll be able to generate more of your own ideas of what needs to be done, how we need to fix this, not just for African Americans, but for all of us. There's a lot that needs to happen for all of us in terms of human freedom, and I think that educating yourself to that is the first step. an indispensable step.
We are honored to have you with us.
Oh, thank you. Stop. Thank you.
The roots of racism in this country began with the European genocide of the Native Americans.
Yeah.
Can you just say something about that issue in regards to understanding history, et cetera?
Well, I'll tell you something that I read once about how once upon a time a bunch of boat people came to this country, and they were dirty and diseased, and they didn't speak the language, and they were, you know where this is going, don't you? And they were a drain on the local economy. But the Americans that they found here took them in and helped them to get a foothold on this continent. And unfortunately, the Americans paid that back with, as you said, a campaign of genocide and. And the rape, raping and taking the land. I think that the genocide of the Native Americans and what happened to African Americans are flip sides of the same coin, which is that there's a sense of entitlement. I believe it was Jackson that called it manifest destiny. Was he the one who named it that? This whole idea that white Europeans had a manifest destiny to rule this vast empire. At one point, they even wanted to be an empire stretching down into Mexico, and actually got good pieces, got pretty good chunk of Mexico out of the bargain. But there was this whole idea of entitlement. The whole idea of whiteness is sort of the root of the issue in this country. Whiteness was the thing. It was sort of this thing that was created in order to justify the crimes against Native Americans and against African Americans. And the falsity, the artificiality of whiteness is found in the fact that many people in this room, for that matter, who would consider themselves white or whose ancestors were white, would not have been considered white even 100 years ago. If you are of Polish background, if you are of Southern Italian background, if you are Slavic background, if you are of Armenian background, none of that was considered white. White was sort of this thing that you had to earn, that had to be conveyed upon you. The problem with African Americans and Native Americans is twofold. One, physically, as a matter of physical difference, they were not able to do what white people from the disfavored parts of Europe could do, which is lose the accent, lose the native clothing, lose the native customs, change your name from Simek to Smith and blend in. African Americans and Native Americans could not do that because of physical differences. And two, I think there's this baggage that African Americans and Native Americans have uniquely. That say German Americans or Jewish Americans, Polish Americans, whatever, don't have with this country. There's this baggage of history of genocide and of slavery. I think that have always stood in the way of advancement. So yeah, what happened to the Native Americans is just the flip side of a very sordid coin. Over here.
I too want to thank you very much for coming and visiting with us. It is indeed an honor.
Thank you.
Yeah, I grew up in Berkeley, California, a community that's 55% non-white, and in the public schools there, we had volunteer busing. Take white kids to the black neighborhood, black kids to the white neighborhood, so the schools would be mixed. Much of the country had forced busing, wasn't very happy about it. I didn't know any different. I thought it was a good thing. Now, as an adult, I've had many, many conversations with people I grew up with and people I didn't grow up with who said this was the worst thing that happened to the country because it further disenfranchised mostly black people, black kids, from leadership positions. Once they got shipped off to the white high school, they were no longer president of the class, et cetera, et cetera. I've always had trouble reconciling that point of view because my student body president was a black girl.
Yeah.
And she went to the university that you did as well. And so, anyway, I was just wondering, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, I can't know if that formulation is true, but if it's true, frankly, it doesn't condemn, assuming it's true for a minute, what is condemned by that is not busing, but America, the kids at the schools. That's the problem. The problem isn't that a black kid is in the school and suddenly he becomes incapable of serving as class president because he was bused across town to get there. The problem is the people who thought he was incapable of being class president once they saw him, once they saw his face. So it's not that to me is not an indictment of busing. It's an indictment of America. It's an indictment of the kids in those schools. Sure.
Yellow?
Hey, where are you? I hear you.
In the corner here. Over here.
Which corner?
Left corner. Hey, yo.
Hey, there you go.
how's it
Okay.
going?
There you go.
So, as a young black man myself, I've been reading about the history of our people, and I find a certain disdain growing the more I read.
Disdain growing in you?
Yeah, and I was wondering, knowing as much as you know, is there any how do you deal with that? And how do you combat those negative emotions?
I think anger is the logical first response. But if anger is if all you get is angry after reading this stuff, then something's wrong somewhere. But I think we're too scared of anger, and I don't mean hitting people, I don't mean violence, I define anger as a passionate impatience with the injustice of the status quo. Okay, and by that definition, if you can read African American history and it doesn't make you angry, then something's wrong with you. So I have no problem with you being angry. I would ask you, where does your anger take you? What does it do for you? Where do you move forward from that? And I would ask you in your anger to remember, as Dr. King said, that the issue is not quote unquote white people per se. The issue is this system that we have here in this country and have had since the beginning that allowed people who identified or misidentified themselves as white to think that because of skin color that they were somehow automatically superior. That's the laziest thing in the world. You're better than me. Why? Because I was born. I mean but that's the mindset. But I also have to remember in that, and you may remember from the speech, I mentioned a couple of people. I mentioned Elijah Lovejoy. Elijah Lovejoy was killed in Alton, Illinois, in the pre-Civil War period because he kept fighting against slavery. He was shot by a mob. They told him he had a newspaper and he kept printing anti-slavery information. And the mob came for him 3 or 4 times and they kept telling him to stop printing this stuff, and he wouldn't stop. And finally, they shot him and threw his printing press in the river. I would just ask you to keep people like that in mind. James Werg, Viola Liuzzo, Carl Van Vechten in another context. All of these people, because there's nothing. Just as there's nothing inherent in being African American that makes you good, bad, whatever. It's a matter of it's what you choose. It's who you are. There's nothing inherent in being white that makes you bad. It's what you choose. It's what you choose to see, and what you choose to understand, and what you choose to do with what you see and understand. So use your anger, sculpt your anger. Try to find purpose and point for your anger. Don't let your anger become hatred. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does.
All righty. And around she goes, and where she stops.
We are all honored to have you, Mr. Pitts. I have always felt that I grew up without prejudice. And one reason I felt that way was because my mother taught in a very small school in a small town. But there was another town not far away that was even smaller, and the entire population there was African American. By happenstance, I spent many happy hours after school when I went to wait for my mother at the high school, because there was a young man from the other town there also, and I don't know what he was waiting for. But while we waited, he got out the basketball, and we spent our time in the gym playing basketball. He was quite tall, he was quite black. His name was Verl Schweitzer. He grew up to be a football hero at Kansas State University, and later something in the administration. And I never knew there was anything different about him. I don't think I really realized, except that he was a good friend. Now, yesterday, I am attending a series of lectures on our history as seen by the Native Americans. And of course, I know the history of, I grew up with cowboy and Indian shows, and I know all about the thing, and while I say, oh, that's terrible, that's bad, emotionally, I never reacted until yesterday, and they were talking about the Revolutionary War, and realizing it even more from the Native American viewpoint, I suddenly realized I could no longer be proud of my great-great-great-grandfather, who was a Minuteman at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. In fact, I'm a little ashamed and I feel guilty. So I think I'm beginning to understand.
Okay. Well, a couple of things. Two main things. You said you're not prejudiced or didn't grow up with prejudice. Everybody's got some prejudice, and that includes me at the microphone. Everybody's got some prejudice. It's like alcoholism. You either, what is it? You're never cured. You're always an alcoholic in recovery. I believe is the language. With this country, you're either a bigot or you're a bigot in recovery. That's just America. That's just America. And the key to it is awareness of it and always sort of, being aware and holding yourself to a standard and catching yourself in the moment of doing, thinking, saying, whatever, something that is based on some feeling that are less or some sense that is less than what you want to be. I'll give you an example. I used to think that I was, I'm pretty enlightened and I got friends from all colors, this, that, and the other. Went to Miami. For the first time, I had these two editors. Lynn's from North Carolina, the other's from Virginia, white ladies. And the first time I heard them talk, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. And I did not know why I was having this response to them. And then it hit me. Okay, white Southern accent in my head equals something that I want to move back from. Now, it turned out that they became, two of my favorite people, two of my favorite editors, good friends. I mean, friends that we socialize outside of the office and everything. But when I first met them, Mr. Enlightenment realized, okay, you got a problem with white Southerners. And let's try to deal with that. I think I'm okay there, but okay, where's my next blind spot? I have no idea where my next blind spot is, but I think part of trying to be a moral human being is understand that there probably is a blind spot somewhere, and that you need to figure out what it is. The other thing that you mentioned is when you're talking about this idea of not being prejudiced, is I think that even if you have the best of intentions, you have to understand that the system in this country is designed, regardless of your intentions, regardless of your character, is designed to afford you privilege. And I will explain white privilege by explaining male privilege to you, okay? Years ago, we bought new tires for our minivan, and about a week after we bought the tires, the right front tire developed this bulge in it. And my wife took the car back to NTB, where we bought. You guys have NTB here? National Tire and Battery, where we had bought the tires from, and she came back to me steaming. This guy had, told her, well, obviously you did something, or you hit a curve or something like that, and we're not going to do anything, and, just very condescending, and she was furious. So I go back up there with her. My intention, frankly, is to get this guy straight for, disrespecting my wife. I don't get a chance to. Because the moment I say we've got this problem with this tire, oh, yes, sir, well, we'll take a look at that right away. Let's put that up here on the lift here, and why don't you just wait in our waiting room, and I'll tell you, I'll be right back. And I told my wife, this is the same guy that, and she's like, steam is just pouring out by this point. Yeah, this is the same guy, okay? And he puts the car up on the lift, and he comes back, and it's a very rare defect, but yeah, it's a manufacturer's defect. We'll have it fixed for you right away. Just wait right here. We'll get you a new tire, okay? That's male privilege. Okay, I didn't have to be a bad guy, I didn't have to be a sexist, but I live in a world that is calibrated for the benefit of me as a man. Everyone in this room, you live in a world that is calibrated for the benefit of you as a white person. And it will be found in interactions just like that one. Just like that one, okay? So, you know, when you say white privilege, people think, I don't have a whole lot of money. What are you talking about? And nothing to do with money. It has nothing to do with money. It has to do with the assumptions that will automatically be made about you, okay? So when we talk about I'm not prejudiced in a given situation, maybe you're not, and that's great, but understand that whether you're prejudiced or not, you operate under a privilege that the rest of us do not have. Who's next?
I have a question.
Last question. Where?
Right here, right next to the one that we just had.
Okay, you faked me out. Usually you go from one side to the other. Yes.
I have a question about asking you to clarify for me, help me clarify what bearing witness means. I am a very privileged white woman who grew up in very white Mankato, Minnesota.
Is it really? No.
My children are...
I guess it is. I'm sorry, go on. I'm sorry, that was mean of me, go on.
My children are African American. My late husband was African American from Miami. I work as a fundraiser, in fact, for the last several years, on behalf of educating Native American students on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. I oftentimes, in the course of my work with very wealthy, very generous, very anxious to absolve themselves of some of the guilt that we feel as white Americans, I find myself in very difficult situations because of the assumption that's made that because I'm a white person,
You feel a certain way.
conversations
Yeah.
that can be had with me are off color, to put it mildly.
Or on color, to
Or
look at it
on
another
color,
way.
to put it more accurately, perhaps. So my question is, as a person who very much wants to bear witness because of who my family is, I'm existing in this structure as keenly aware of it as I am. Am I bearing witness, or am I just am I keeping quiet and raising money for
For a worthy cause, or
for Native American students so they can bear witness?
Are you making a moral trade-off that is in fact moral?
Yes.
Only you can say that. I can't. I told you I've had enough of being bartender, rabbi, and priest. I get the trade-off that you're talking about. You'd have to figure out if what you're doing for Native Americans is worth allowing these folks to get by with what they're saying, or maybe just, as a sort of passive-aggressive rebuke, next time you're around these folks, bring your kids. That might say all that you need to say right there. I mean, I share what you're saying, because sometimes it's difficult to, when do you speak up to people about their stuff, and particularly if people are writing you checks that are needed for a very good cause, when and how do you speak up to them? But I think that there are quiet ways in which to do so, and one of which for you in your specific situation might just be take my sons and daughters to work day and let them see your kids. And tell me again that joke you were telling me the other day, because my son didn't hear it, depending on how passive aggressive you want to be. Are we done? We're finito. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.